All right, we got another quick video today about API testing. There's not going to be a lab in this one, just because it's kind of a short, bite-sized video, but we should have a few more in the coming videos that are a little bit more lengthy. So let's just go ahead and jump in. So what is an API? Well, API is an application programming interface, and it allows for different software systems and applications to share data between each other. An example might be something like a weather application. The application logic doesn't have like the inherent ability to determine like the weather, but it would rather make a call to some weather forecast API that then pulls that data from some backend system and then responds to it in some way. Most dynamic websites are comprised of APIs. You could classify like SQL injection and other injection attacks as like part of an API test. But we're going to be focusing on kind of just really generic like JSON or RESTful APIs for just the purpose of the fact that those are probably the most common. Let's just jump in with reconnaissance and documentation. And then my short soapboxing for this is basically, if you work as a tester or like a pen tester or something and you're doing an API test, really make sure that you jump in and just get as much documentation as possible, be that in the form of test cases, internal documentation, internal use cases for the application. And if you're, trying to purchase one of these tests, try to avoid a red teamy kind of approach or a gray, like a black box test kind of approach, because if you're hiring testers, right, you can't hire them for like months at a time, but attackers are going to be digging away at your stuff for months. I mean, they have the time and the resources to sit there and just hang out and spend, just a couple months passively trying to reverse engineer how your API works, if they can make valid calls, if they can do things. So if you want the testers to get a lot of work done in a short amount of time, it benefits you to give them as much information as possible about the API so that they could accurately reflect what months of work for an attacker might look like. So that's kind of my short like soapbox. Like, I've heard some people talk about like how API testing is out of scope on like social media and stuff, and I don't know how true that is, but API testing is, I would argue, pretty important, because if there's an issue in a big API that's commonly used, it could have really far-reaching consequences for a lot of different use cases. So just something to think about, just something to keep in mind as you get into this. But we'll go ahead and start talking about documentation a little bit. You'll find, if it's a public API, there's going to be public documentation. If it's private and you're working for like a development team for their API, you're going to want them to just give you access to the documentation that they've had on how it works, how you set up an environment to use it, what the test cases are supposed to look like, if you're supposed to be doing those tests just using HTTP and JSON, or if there's some special tooling used to run these tests. Those questions are things that you're going to need to ask and find out the answers to. Enumerating endpoints. You can use like Burp Suite Professional has like a mapping tool or like a crawler that you can use. Using FUF is also nice. If you just have word lists you feel like using, just go ahead and spam those at endpoints, and you might find a couple things. Just set it on recursive mode and it'll run a couple checks. Like in CTFs, I found a few endpoints or API like type endpoints by just running FUF or Dirbuster with recursive mode on and seeing what happens. So yeah, I mean, that's the basics as far as those goes. These are a few examples. So like, if you're sending requests back and forth in your browser and you notice this come up in your repeater, this is an indication. I mean, obviously API is right there, but take a look at, instead of just API products 6 price, maybe look at 6, maybe look at products, maybe look at price. Try to dig into each of those endpoints, see if you can actually interact with the API without any kind of authorization or without any extra kind of keys. In this case, if you send something to price, it returns the price of the object and some message relating to it. So, this JSON context here. And then if you were to send a patch request, so changing the HTTP method here to a patch would result in, okay, you've got a client error, you need to submit, application JSON content type. And then if you change your content type, you might be able to actually just submit new changes to the price. This is one of the exercises on PortSwigger's Academy, where you can basically do just that. I really recommend those just because they're really bite-sized and they're not as complicated as some of the CTF examples that I've done. And the reason I didn't include those is because it kind of takes a lot longer to pick apart like a multi function like API on screen, but the PortSwigger labs are just so short, sweet, and to the point. So I recommend giving those a try if you're just dipping your toe in the water right now for API testing anyway. That being said, the next thing we can talk about is server-side parameter pollution. This is kind of, how do I describe it? So like some APIs are going to be internal and you're not going to be able to access them from the public internet. So like you might not be able to send a request from your host to the internal API endpoint. So you're going to have to do parameter pollution by, messing with how that data is going to be treated after the application packages it up and sends it. So you might be able to do some pollution in query strings with like the pounds character, the and character, or like the equals character. Those can give you some interesting stuff. So like, if you've got like a social media platform that lets you search for usernames, right? Don't mind this equal sign here. That's a typo. But like if you're searching for a name and the back parameter is home or something, for example, and this is the request that's being sent by your, through HTTP. This is what that just looks like. But this is the actual request that's being sent to the API. So it's actually conducting a search, user's search name is Josh and public profile is true. So if it's a private profile, there shouldn't be any search results for this. The problem with this is like, if you can truncate that query string somehow with like a pound character. So if you URL encode a pound character behind Josh and before this and, you might be able to get the rest of this query or the rest of this, the rest of this query truncated and dropped off. And then it's going to return every single search result for Josh, regardless of whether or not it's public regardless of whether or not it's public or private. Another example might be injecting parameters entirely. So normally you might say, okay, user search, Josh, in this case, we're also adding the parameter by URL encoding the and character. And so we're adding email as this. This would just also, it might, it might be more prevalent in something like if you're sending a post request to change somebody's email, if this is how it constructs the change email request, that might be a problem. Obviously this is a search, but you kind of get the idea. Is like you can manipulate the way that your strings are being handled so that you could, change how the API is interpreting them, which is why it's, server side parameter pollution is you have to kind of package this up in such a way that it only really gets turned into something devious once it gets across that first borderline. Obviously there's more examples than this, and it's really going to come up as like a need to, or like, a when you're going to use it basis. It really depends on the environment you're in and how you're going to go about exploiting it. But that being said, no lab for this one. We'll talk about prevention. So really make sure that your documentation for this, if you're using a private API that you developed, make sure that that documentation is only accessible internally, and don't use like, public API keys, and don't leak your API keys, right? If that's how, easier said than done, sure. But, just keep an eye on it. If you've got, I saw like a Twitter post that was, I hope it was a joke, but it was, some employee who had like their laptop open and you could see like a file that had like multiple API keys to, some higher level function at this company. And it's like, okay, don't do that. Make sure your API keys aren't public and that you have to generate unique ones at least for each developer that's working on it. And on the content of developers, we can kind of jump to this last one. Use protections on all your versions and make sure that, you're not just using protections on production environment. This is important because when you have people testing your, environment, they're probably not going to be testing production. They're going to be testing some kind of development environment. And if you don't have the same protections on one of your development environments that you do for production, you're not really getting your money's worth for that test because you can't accurately, determine what an attacker could be capable of on a prod environment. So just keep that in mind. Use generic error messages to avoid telling the attackers more information than they need. Use an allow list for your HTTP methods. Like I shouldn't be able to just patch in or delete. Use those other methods to do things I shouldn't be able to do. And then keep your documentation up to date so that testers can be efficient when they're testing your environment. This module is pretty new from Burp Suite, or not Burp Suite, from Portswicker, the company who owns Burp Suite. But that being said, I think it's a really good introduction to API testing, but because of the kind of, situational or context-based approach that you're going to have to take to API tests, it's good that they're including all this like, hey, documentation is really important type information. So that's all we've got for this one. I'll catch you in the next video.